Life, Louis contracted the disease that would haunt his final years, syphilis. The poet king, once filled with dreams of art and learning, began to unravel from the inside out. His skin, once smooth and noble, broke out in sores. His joints ached, his memory faltered. The court watched in silence as their young monarch became a shadow of himself, a living ruin cloaked in silk. Physicians with their leeches and mercury could only make him worse. They whispered theories and offered prayers, but none could stop the slow descent. Louis withdrew from court life. The poetry stopped. The light dimmed, and when he died, at just 27, Portugal lost more than a king. It lost a soul whose reign might have changed the kingdom's course. But fate had been written not in policy, but in the bloodstream. Across continents, across centuries, the same silent killer threaded its way through royal veins. In candlelit chambers of Versailles, in cold stone fortresses of Prague and golden palaces of Persia, it moved like a phantom, always hidden, always patient, and always devastating, because this was not a plague of peasants. It was a predator of kings, a quiet assassin that took lovers first, then lineage, then legacy. History does not often speak of it, too shameful, too personal. But beneath every treaty broken, every war sparked by succession, every sudden collapse of power, there lies the question: what really killed the king? And how much of the world we know was shaped by what was whispered behind closed doors, by symptoms denied and by heirs never born? For syphilis, the so-called great imitator, was more than a disease. It was a domino in royal destinies. It mocked crowns. It ignored wealth. It hollowed out empires from within. The Medici, the Habsburgs, the Safavids, even the Tudors, none were spared. In Spain it said that Philip IV suffered from signs of the affliction, and his weakened state fed the decline of Spanish power. In Russia, whispers circled the court of Ivan the Terrible's erratic behavior, sudden rages and paranoia, not just madness, but maybe madness fed by infection. Even in the shadows of the Vatican, papal power bore its stains. Cardinal Cesare Borgia, a brilliant military leader and schemer, is believed to have suffered syphilitic decay that twisted his once striking appearance into something ghastly. In portraits, his face tightens with an unnatural grimace, his once handsome features eaten by lesions time could not heal. And what of the lives changed not by death but by disgrace? In women who were blamed for infertility when the rot came from their husbands, sons who were never born, dynasties that broke not on the battlefield, but in the bedroom. Behind every royal portrait hangs an invisible specter. Behind every golden crown, a curse. Because in an age when kings ruled by divine right, what did it mean when the divine could not protect them? What did it mean when the very bodies of the chosen were no longer pure? These monarchs were supposed to be God's anointed, but what if the gods had turned away? What if the throne itself had become a seat of infection? And what if the real story of Europe's power wasn't one of strategy and war, but of disease, unseen, untreated, unstoppable? The tragedy of syphilis was not only its cruelty, but its irony. It traveled with love, with lust, with intimacy. It thrived in the very acts meant to bind families, create heirs, forged alliance. It twisted joy into grief, passion into poison, and worst of all, it lingered. It passed through generations. A grandfather's sin becoming a grandson's curse, a fleeting affair costing a century of peace. We speak of royal bloodlines as if they are sacred and unbroken, but history shows us otherwise. These lines were fragile, fractured, rewritten by disease as much as by decree. And in their weakness, the course of the world shifted. Wars were fought not just over land or ideology, but over questions of legitimacy, questions born from sickbeds, miscarriages, and the quiet shame of kings. Pushed mercury, arsenic, and bloodletting, not to cure but to preserve appearances. Better to die from treatment than to admit the truth. And so truth itself began to rot. Not all records survive. Some were burned, some never written. But in the gaps of history, the shape of disease emerges. In the sudden silence of a promising prince, in the quiet burial of a stillborn child, in the hastily arranged marriage that replaced a bride who took ill.
Even in the change of fashion, high collars, powdered wigs, fans to cover sores, the signs are there. We just haven't always looked closely enough, and so we come to the darkest irony of all, that the rulers of the world, cloaked in silk and gold, were never safe, that the mighty were as vulnerable as the meek, that power could not purchase immunity.
That thrones were built not on granite, but on fragile human flesh, and flesh fails. Over and over again, history remembers what it wants to remember. The victories, the coronations, the myths. But in the silence between those stories lies another history. One of pain, of fear, of secrets buried with the dead. A history whispered through ruined bones, locked letters, and stained linens. This is the history of a disease that wore a mask and danced with kings, a parasite that chose no side, favored no nation, and devoured empires from within. A plague so intimate, it never needed to invade. It only had to be invited.
It begins again, this time in the icy corridors of Russian grandeur, where opulence concealed rot and paranoia held the throne tighter than any monarch ever could. Tsar Peter III was never meant to rule alone. Born weak in constitution and mind, he was groomed more like a puppet than a sovereign. But bloodline demanded obedience, and so he wore the crown, awkward and unsteady. Behind the polished walls of the Winter Palace, he spent hours with toy soldiers and foreign uniforms, obsessed with Prussian war games, but blind to the brewing storm within his own empire. His wife, the formidable Catherine, watched with growing contempt as her husband unraveled. He drank heavily, he raged without cause. He suffered hallucinations. Many believed he was simply mad, but others, physicians, chambermaids, secret lovers, spoke in whispers of sores hidden beneath royal robes, of nights filled with fever and confusion. Peter III, it seemed, may have been yet another victim of this same silent plague. Syphilis does not discriminate. It waits, it festers, and in Peter, it turned a fool into a liability. Within months, Catherine moved swiftly. The coup was staged. The Tsar was arrested, and days later, dead. Officially, it was illness. But in the shadows of the Romanov court, the whispers never stopped. It wasn't politics that killed Peter. It was his body, breaking from the inside. Catherine would go on to rule as one of Russia's greatest leaders, but even her reign bore the scars of inherited disease. Her lovers died young, her children faced mystery ailments, and still the doctors prescribed mercury. Still the court refused to speak the name aloud, because to name it was to acknowledge that the divine right of kings could be undone by the most human of afflictions: desire. Cross the continent to Prussia, to the coldly brilliant Frederick the Great, a man of culture, intellect, and ruthless military precision. He built an empire with strategy and fire, yet never married, never sired heirs. He surrounded himself with men, philosophers, composers, and rumors. Rumors that he was not only celibate but perhaps hiding something far deeper. His closest confidants noted his long absences, sudden ailments, and a distinct stiffness in movement in his later years. Some modern historians speculate, was it a broken spirit, a wounded youth, or something far more biological? One letter hints at painful lesions, another at bouts of violent headaches and memory lapses. The truth, like so much in royal history, was likely buried with him, because in courts where power was absolute, vulnerability was treason. Even in illness, kings had to pretend they were invincible, and so silence reigned. Across the Channel, in the flickering gaslight of Victorian London, Syphilis no longer confined itself to royal palaces. It had become the disease of the city. Brothels teemed with infected clients. Hospitals overflowed with cases, and the wealthy were no more protected than the poor. In fact, they were often the most infected, shielded by privacy, but not by morality. In the house of a rising politician named Benjamin Disraeli, a servant girl named Annie was dismissed without cause. She had worked there for 3 years. She had never been late. She was never seen again. Later, in a hidden hospital ward, a Jane Doe fitting her description died of complications from advanced syphilis. Her story, like thousands of others, was erased, unworthy of the record books. But the disease didn't stop with the nameless. It climbed the ranks. It entered Parliament. It touched the church, priests, professors, poets, everyone. No one talked about it. No one admitted. But the red rash beneath powdered skin, the sudden tremors, the loss of speech, these were the real secrets of the age. Even Charles Darwin's circle was not untouched. One of his closest colleagues, a brilliant naturalist, went mad in his 40s. At first it was called nervous exhaustion. Then melancholia. Finally he was locked away. Historians now suspect neurosyphilis, the final, most devastating form of the illness, where the brain itself decays, slowly and irreversibly. And perhaps this is the cruelest part of all, that syphilis did not only destroy the body, but the mind. It turned kings into cowards, poets into madmen, queens into ghosts. It left no scars on stone monuments, but shattered every heart it touched. And in the New World, it began to mutate into something even more horrifying. When Columbus returned from the Americas, he brought not just gold, not just conquest, but a biological weapon. The first outbreaks of syphilis in Europe occurred just years after his return, spreading faster than any known disease before it. Some say it came from the Caribbean. Others argue it was always in Europe, lying dormant. But what's undeniable is what followed. Soldiers in Naples lost their noses. Women in Paris wore veils not for modesty, but to hide lesions. By 1500, the disease had become so violent it was nicknamed the French disease, Neapolitan disease, Spanish sickness, depending on who you hated most. It was always someone else's fault, but no one could stop it. In the brothels of Venice, the paintings of Titian were rumored to show courtesans with the early signs of infection. In the corridors of the Spanish Inquisition, victims were accused of witchcraft, when all they had were the ravages of disease. Across Europe, saints were prayed to, relics kissed, sinners burned. And still, syphilis spread. It became the secret heartbeat of early modern Europe, a disease without borders, a sickness stitched into the very fabric of civilization. By the 17th century, even physicians were dying from it, the very men who experimented on their patients with calomel and mercury vapor, desperate for a cure. And then there were the treatments, the madness of trying to stop madness. In Tudor England, sufferers were locked in sweat boxes, their bodies blistered with boiling wine and sulfur. In Paris, doctors injected mercury directly into the bloodstream, turning the cure into a second sentence of agony. The mouth rotted, teeth fell out, skin peeled, and still the disease remained, because it was smarter than them all, and it had no mercy. It turned love into punishment, power into fragility, and time into a slow drip of dread. By the time we reach the 1800s, syphilis had become both a disease and a metaphor. The great pox symbolized corruption, excess, hidden shame. It was the punishment for indulgence, but also the consequence of ignorance. Artists like Baudelaire and Schubert lived with it. Some, like Nietzsche, died from it. Genius and madness blurred. Whole philosophies may have been shaped under its influence. In whispered confessionals, priests heard stories of decay they could never repeat. In asylum halls, brilliant minds wasted away beneath vaulted ceilings. And behind it all, history marched forward, quietly directed by an invisible hand. The wars came, the empires collapsed, new powers rose, but still the same old disease lingered. Underground, untreated, unnamed, and even now, in the bloodlines of power, some secrets remain. And now we arrive at the 20th century, the age of science, steel, and empire, where the myth of invincibility had finally taken hold. Men flew, machines roared, and medicine began to wield real weapons against death. But for all its advancements, the world was still not free from its oldest shadows. Because while wars raged and ideologies collided, syphilis continued its quiet reign, not as a plague of the masses, but as a mark of the elite, a curse that crept through the polished corridors of modern power, hidden beneath starched collars and pressed uniforms. It was no longer just a disease. It had become a symbol. And nowhere did that symbol burn more tragically than in the mind of a man who would shape the fate of the world, Adolf Hitler. For decades, speculation has haunted the pages of historical inquiry. Official records were sanitized, autopsies were obscured, but eyewitnesses, physicians, even those closest to him whispered of tremors, rashes, and the strange hollowing of his once fiery presence. Hitler's private physician, Dr. Theo Morell, kept detailed notes, many later destroyed, some leaked among the scattered pages, records of repeated genital infections, odd dietary treatments, bizarre suppositories, and a cocktail of medications associated not with mental health, but with venereal disease. Some scholars dismiss the idea, others are convinced Hitler may have suffered from advanced syphilis. If true, the implications are harrowing. The rages, the paranoia, the sleepless nights, the catastrophic decisions, all potentially twisted by a brain infected and decaying from within. The Holocaust, the war, the collapse of Europe, not just the result of ideology but perhaps of rot. A terrifying glimpse into how a microscopic spiral-shaped bacterium could shape the greatest evil of the modern age. And yet, Hitler was not alone. In the jazz-age salons of Paris where artists drank absinthe and danced with shadows, the disease became almost fashionable. Writers romanticized their decay, musicians played through the tremors. The world knew of the horrors, but it was cloaked in poetry and perfume. Josephine Baker, the stunning American dancer who conquered French cabarets, lost lovers to the disease. F. Scott Fitzgerald's contemporaries were riddled with it. And across the ocean in Harlem, where the Renaissance was blooming, poets like Claude McKay and singers like Bessie Smith performed in neighborhoods where treatments were rare and silence was law. Syphilis had evolved, from feared to familiar, and that made it all the more dangerous. In 1932, a new chapter in this cursed history began. In the American South, in Macon County, Alabama, the U.S. Public Health Service launched the Tuskegee Study. 600 black men, many poor sharecroppers, were enrolled under the false promise of free health care. What they received instead was a slow-motion horror show. They were not treated, they were observed. Even after penicillin became widely available in the 1940s, the cure was withheld. Year after year, the men were watched as they deteriorated. Blindness, madness, death. Their wives were infected. Their children were born with congenital syphilis. It wasn't science. It was betrayal. For 40 years, the study continued. The secret buried in government archives. The victims dismissed as data. When the truth was finally revealed in 1972, the country was horrified. But the damage had already been done. Generations destroyed, trust shattered, and a new understanding of what syphilis truly was. Not just a disease, but a weapon, a test of ethics, a mirror to our darkest impulses. The world now knew how far people would go in the name of knowledge, and yet, in some parts of the world, it was still business as usual. In South America, dictators and generals ruled with impunity, many living in grand isolation, surrounded by concubines, bribed doctors, and secret treatments. Rumors swirled around Juan Perón. Others pointed to Augusto Pinochet's inner circle. No one could prove it, but in backroom clinics, treatments continued in secret. Penicillin shipped in under different names. Patient charts marked only with numbers. Even now, in the 21st century, the story hasn't ended. In the age of satellites and genetic engineering, syphilis is not extinct. In fact, it's rising again, quietly, steadily, slipping through the cracks of modern medicine. In wealthy cities, in rural towns, among the powerful, among the forgotten. Because shame still clings to it. Because silence still protects it. Because history taught us to hide it. And so the cycle continues. It mutates. It returns. And it reminds us, disease is never just about biology. It's about class, access, secrets, pride. In Silicon Valley boardrooms, behind polished TED Talks and philanthropic empires, there are private clinics handling discrete cases. In the capitals of power, among celebrities and heads of state, NDAs cover more than just politics. The stigma of syphilis remains untouched by progress. We treat it, yes, but we do not speak of it. We do not teach its full story. And perhaps that's the most haunting part of all. That after centuries of devastation, the greatest lesson this disease leaves behind is how desperately humans will cling to their masks. Syphilis, the great imitator, has always known this. It doesn't kill quickly. It waits. It lets its host believe they are fine, that they are safe, that the worst has passed. And then, like clockwork, it returns. A lesion here, a headache there, a forgotten rash, a failed pregnancy, a slow slip into dementia. It doesn't need armies. It doesn't need headlines. It only needs silence. And silence, history shows us, is humanity's most consistent offering. From Lorenzo de' Medici to the dying poets of Vienna, from the Romanovs to the black men of Tuskegee, from unnamed queens to emperors who died childless, this single spiral-shaped organism threaded itself through power, through pain, through legacy. It shaped borders, decided wars, stole futures, and it continues. Quiet, patient, invisible, the disease that ruled the rulers, the great rot beneath the crown, the one truth history never wanted to tell, because it did not fit the myth of glory. But history, if you listen closely, still whispers it. In ruined tombs, in altered bloodlines, in empty cradles, in the madness of men once considered gods. The truth was never in the wars. It was never in the speeches. It was in the shadows of their bodies, in the secrets they took to their graves, and perhaps in the secrets still to come. Because when the next king dies, the next queen breaks down, the next heir disappears without explanation, what will we be told? Pneumonia? Exhaustion? A heart too weak for this cruel world? Or will we ask what really took them? What unspoken shame moved through their lineage like a ghost? That's the question syphilis leaves us with. Not just what it did, but what it still might do.